So yesterday I showed you all the video of 46-year-old African-American man George Floyd being murdered at the hands of police, or I should say at the knees of police, while he was crying out, begging for help. Since then, thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest his murder. And I want to show you this clip of this young man here. He has, I think he does a really good job expressing the grievances that so many people are feeling. Let's take a look.
You guys to be okay tonight and to stop this chaos.
It ain't me. It's not me. I'm gonna let y'all know that now. It's not us guys neither. And I'm glad that y'all said that. It's not us. It's the police. This the madness that they spark up. This is what they encourage. This is what they provoke. This is what you get out of you taking a loved one from someone. This is what you get. You get a lot of people that's hurt, and they can't vent the right way. They can no longer depend on the police to be here to protect us like they say they gonna do. So this is what you get. And no, it's not gonna end today. I can't tell you it's gonna end tomorrow. I don't know when it's gonna end. But it's for y'all to start. We're not the ones that's killing us. Y'all killing us. We can't make a change if y'all don't change.
So, I mean, you see there just a powerful speech from that young man, powerful words there. And it has almost an eternal character to it, it would seem. Like you could play that clip 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. You could have played it in 1945 and it would have still made sense. You could have played that clip just about at any point in time in the history of this country and those words would have rung true. Those words would have made sense and they would have been coherent because it just really speaks to the eternal nature of racism and the struggle against racism of black people in this country, the kind of just vicious racism that this country was founded on, and the outrage which he feels that, you know, look, man, these police, they're here to protect and serve. They say that they're here for us, but then they don't do that. And we've really seen that over the past, I'd say, 24 hours when you really follow like how police officers have been responding to the sorts of, to the protest. I mean, you can see here in this clip, I'll make it a little bit so you can hear it there, but I mean you can just see there just how, you know, the police officers just are like completely overreacting to this situation. I mean, why does he need to get paid? Like, right? What is, like you know, what are they doing? Now, we saw just a couple weeks ago, by the way, you'll remember, we saw just a few weeks ago, we saw the protests of people who didn't want to wear a mask, who people were done social distancing. They, you know, didn't want to have to stay inside, and they had guns on the state capitol building in Minnesota. And yet, of course, there was none of this. They weren't called riots. They weren't labeled as, I saw one person on Twitter saying that these are apes rioting and destroying our stuff. Completely racist, completely disgusting and racist remarks are being used against these protesters who are justly protesting the murder of a fellow member of their community. And the other thing I do want to point out here is they're using tear gas, which is always something that I've really been upset about and I find quite disgusting. Tear gas would be a war crime. If you used that same thing, if those police officers started shooting tear gas at a racist Nazi in the middle of World War II, that would be considered to be a war crime. You couldn't do that, but you shoot it up at black people who are rightly and justly protesting the unjust murder of someone, then it's considered okay. Then it's fine. In fact, it's just practice. It's how they're taught. It's how they're trained. It's what we tell them that they're supposed to do in such an instance. And it really goes to show you how, one of the statements that we saw coming out shortly after George Floyd's murder, one of the things we saw was, oh, well, everybody involved, Amy Klobuchar saying in this, I talked about it in my last video, Amy Klobuchar coming out, everybody involved needs to, all the police officers need to face some kind of justice. It's more than that, though, because this keeps happening in police departments across the country. Police need to be seriously reformed. And, and I'm almost stuck, because there are people out there, I saw them in my comments for the last video I made about this. People are like, oh, this isn't a big deal. We don't have to do anything about this. No need to worry. How are you going to watch that video and think that? How are you going to watch that video of George Floyd being murdered when he's saying, I can't breathe, you're going to kill me? And when he says, I can't breathe, the officer presses harder. The officer leans in further, hurting him more just because he's begging for help. How are you going to watch that and think, oh, there's nothing wrong here, nothing to see? How are you going to see the statistics? How are you going to look at the numbers and think to yourself, okay, well, there's nothing we need to worry about here. There's nothing we need to do. Now, look, I agree that, you know, there's a debate to be had when it comes to how exactly to reform, right? Like different people who are, seriously interested in reforming and fixing the massive racism which exists in our police departments, people disagree on sort of the details on how you exactly do that, right? Like there's debates to be had there. But when you start saying, oh, when you hear people saying, oh, well, there's nothing to be done here. Like, how are you going to argue with that? How are you going to look at that video? How are you going to watch that and not feel sympathy? Anyway, I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that some people even like don't see it. So I want to show you guys. This was out from the Guardian. There's some just really just I think stunning and eye-opening photos of how these protests are playing out, and I think that it is really important for us to follow. I'm out in Virginia, so pretty far away for me to go, but um, I think we can be there in solidarity in some sense and, do what we can to, speak to our local representatives, do what we can in our area to make sure that we're doing the best to, reform things in our community. And I think, really having kind of solidarity with the protesters in as many ways, as few ways as, the very few ways which we can who, aren't able to be there in person is pretty important. I mean, this photo I think really struck me. I think this has become kind of the caption photo that a lot of people are talking about, how, they stayed out in the rain, they stayed out through the night, they stayed out in light of tear gas being used at them. Again, a war crime being used on our own citizens. I mean, it just shows you how much of a struggle people feel, right? How angry people are and how unjust it is. Like, you can't watch you almost can't look at these pictures and think to yourself, "Oh, everything's fine." You know what I mean? Cuz some people say, "Oh, well, everything's fine. It's not really a big deal. We don't really need to worry about it." That's what some people say. I think those people are completely wrong. In fact, in many cases, there's a lot of racism motivating people saying stuff like that. But how are you going to look at that and see all these people who are upset, all these people who have grievances? You go and talk to just about any black person and they all got a story of a time when the police stopped them, when the police said something or did something or messed with them in some way. Fortunately, not all of them end in murder, but the fact that something like that exists, the fact that you have so many people so upset, it leads you to stop. You have to think to yourself, well, something must be wrong. Something's got to change. Something's got to change. Again, you can debate the specifics on how that change goes about because people disagree there. Even, the best people in the African American community have, detailed, sort of disagreements on the details about how you make those reforms. But you gotta believe that there's time for, I mean, what's this guy doing? Why are they launching tear gas? Which, by the way, I've been to some protests before. And honestly, when it's almost always the police who escalate things, they're like, oh, well, we've got to break up these protests because, they're in the middle of the road. And so they start driving vehicles, they start doing stuff. And yeah, of course that aggravates people. Like, and to see, I mean, you just see these super stark, just powerful images, powerful photos. And, it just, it's, it has to motivate you to act in some way. Now, major development in this story, which is pretty important, is that the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, is now saying officially that there must be charges pressed against these officers. So here's a quote from when he said it. "Why is the man who killed George Floyd now in jail? If you had done it or I had done it, we would be behind bars right now." So obviously now the mayor is saying that there should be charges pressed. Now, we haven't yet heard from the mayor what exactly he thinks those charges should look like. Yesterday, he was saying that they needed to be terminated, and the officers were shortly after terminated, after he made the demands that, the officers needed to be terminated. But he stayed back from saying that they needed to be charged. He, I guess, I don't know what else he needed to see, but he's now coming out saying they need to be charged, but he hasn't yet clarified what exactly those charges are going to be. I mean, I said in my last video, clearly the charges need to be murder. It's quite possible that he would be more interested in a manslaughter charge. I don't think that that's, quite acceptable, although, to be honest, compared to many of the other cases, even just getting a manslaughter charge and conviction would be a lot more than what we've seen, in other instances. Nonetheless, though, this is a sort of a step, and we are seeing the story develop. So he could come out and say, you know, we need to charge them with murder. We're going to have to see. Also, the family of George Floyd is now officially coming out saying that they believe that the officers need to be charged with murder. So that's a major development in this story. You know, obviously, this is a fast-moving story. We're going to have to see how it develops. We're going to have to see, you know, what happens in terms of the protest. But that's sort of where things stand right now. Protesters protesting over the night, justly and rightly, you know, rightfully staying in the streets, and they are still there now. So we'll have to see how this story develops.